speaking of passage of time, one of the guys here, I don't know if you're following the comments, the chat. Adam asked if we're gonna talk about the Liberty. I guess he's talking about the USS Liberty. So you wanna just say a few words. So I mean, if we're gonna deal with conspiracies about Israel being naughty, and also the conspiracy there is also.
I mean, we went back 20 years. Are we really going to go back now more than 50 years to that story?
Well. So what's the question about the USS Liberty?
Oh, he didn't ask a question. Just I think most Israelis don't even know what that is and what happened there.
The USS Liberty, I think, is about as different of a situation as you can get from what we're talking about, because the USS Liberty, Israel admitted its blame, its share of the blame, which was most of the blame for the USS Liberty. The only other party that had any sort of blame was the U.S. Navy was negligent in putting the U.S. Liberty where it was, because by the time the assault on the Liberty happened, its mission in the Mediterranean is basically meaningless. The war had already been decided on the Sinai Peninsula. It was the third day of the war, June 8th. 1967. So as far as should the Liberty have even been there at the time, in terms of a mission, its mission was obsolete, and a lot of the survivors of the Liberty are also angry at the U.S. Navy for putting them in danger as a defenseless ship.
They weren't supposed to be there. It was
in a war zone.
Yeah, there was zero sense of them being there.
Well, so the U.S. Navy used to have these ships that were called ATRs. They were, I think, auxiliary technical research. I could be wrong. And the Liberty was clearly marked. I don't think that there was really plot. I mean, there's excuses for why the attack happened, but there's no doubt that the Israeli Air Force and the Navy attacked the ship on that afternoon. And the explanations they give for it, they don't really fly for me. And I think certainly that if I was a veteran of the Liberty, I certainly wouldn't accept a lot of the explanations. The reports the Israelis released were basically trying to wash the blame away from their own people. But
I mean, the biggest thing is that the Israelis admit that there was they made errors.
Right.
But the big thing is that there was a big U.S. flag. That's the big story on the ship, which the Israeli pilots claimed that they didn't see, and that's the big
that's the point of contention.
Was there a flag? Yeah,
right.
That's the point of contention.
So I was going to do some material a couple months ago on the USS Liberty, and in order to do it, I read 3 books, and there's other books out there I haven't read, which depending on how much research you want to do. This is by James Ennis, Assault on the Liberty, where he was a survivor of the attack, but the problem with this, which is something that is brought up by the next book that I also read by A.J. Crystal, he's called an Israeli apologist, but James Ennis, like a lot of the other witnesses, was below decks during the attack because he was wounded. So a lot of the information that he's sharing is collected from other people. So people like to say, well, you're disputing the testimony of witnesses there. Look, James Ennis gets it secondhand from other survivors of the attack, just like everyone else. So he compiled a lot of the witness testimony, which is good. A lot of that testimony didn't make it into the official Navy, what do they call it, the court at sea, court of inquiry. So a lot of that testimony was compiled by him. And yes, it's important for people to get their version out there. Now, is every version going to really reveal anything that changes the story? What does he contend that the court of inquiry claimed? He contends that there were more strafing runs by the Air Force, and he also claims that the U.S. Navy was, the Israeli Navy, that they had plenty of evidence before them when they pulled up on the ship that it wasn't the ship that had previously been identified, which was an an Egyptian troop transport. So yeah, I think that there's important gaps in the Israeli story that are revealed by James Ennis. But if you read through these three books, so there's the Ennis book, there's this one by A.J. Crystal, which gives some of the explanations of some of the more wild theories, such as that Moshe Dayan personally ordered the attack, which is not really possible given where Dayan was that day. So I think people should read up on it, but you're not going to find anything that has changed over the past, 52 years, 53 years almost. The last book I read is the best one if you're just looking to read one. This was published, I think, in 2011 by James Scott, who's the son of one of the survivors of the Liberty. So the difference that I think between the two cases is that there's no culpability for any crime by the Israeli movers in 9/11. There was no evidence of foreknowledge. There's no evidence of any sort of surveillance that they had. There's very, very spotty evidence of connection to the Israeli government, mainly from previous service and the intelligence unit of the intelligence corps of the Israeli military. And I would say that the people who want to lump them together, they're doing a real disservice and trying to. So look, I'm a person, I do believe in a foreign policy where the U.S. doesn't give foreign aid to any country. It doesn't matter what the cause is. We can manage our policies through trade instead of aid. And I've been trying to make the case to audiences, both within the broader American public and among American Jews. And I guess now I'd be trying to make it to you guys who are over there in Israel and, the rest of the world, that this dependence on American aid, even if it's just perceived dependence, does not really, it's not a sustainable policy. That position is harder to argue when you have clowns running around talking about the USS Liberty, which happened prior to most of the U.S. connection to Israel in terms of military aid. In fact, in 1967, Israeli military
they weren't
equipment,
exactly on our side. In 67, the U.S. wasn't exactly on Israel's side. People for some reason, first of all, people mistake the fact that the U.S. population, for the most part, the populace within the United States, was very pro-Israel, even before Israel was a thing. And obviously this goes back to Protestants and evangelists and the place of Israel and the return of the Jews to the land of Israel, as it stands in Christian theology, specifically the Protestant one, and even more so dispensationalists and all those various streams within Christianity. But if you go, Go on.
So let me jump in there. So like I said, so if you want to read one book that gives like a lot of the better context, and this isn't a book that's sympathetic to Israel, but it's not also demonizing anyone in particular. It criticizes both the Navy, the Israeli government, the Johnson administration, the Naval High Command, I think that they're called the Chief of Staff of the Navy. And the naval staff. So James Scott goes through the conflict that President Johnson had because he wanted Israel to leverage American public support for the Israeli side in the war in order to generate a little more support for the Vietnam War among the American public, according to him. And there were debates between him and his staff members about how this could be used in order to improve public opinion about Vietnam. So President Johnson actually took a lot of, he covered up a lot of it simply because he didn't want this to become a different foreign policy problem for him after the Liberty happened, and it didn't really work. But the fact is, the United States supported Israel in 1967 on a They didn't want the Soviet-aligned countries like Egypt and Syria to win, and it was a good excuse me, geopolitical victory for them, because Israel was more arrayed on the American side. They captured Soviet military equipment in the war. So there were some benefits from Israel winning the war to the U.S., both geopolitically and on an intelligence level. And it was an embarrassment to the Soviet Union, because the Egyptian army was outfitted with some of the latest air and air missile and land equipment that the Soviets had to offer, and it didn't really help them. So, but the Liberty incident would have complicated all of that, and that's why I believe that there was a cover-up for 10 years. But the fact is, so these are a couple main points. Israel did admit that they were responsible the day of the attack. People quibble over the fact that it was 2 hours late, but it was the day of the attack. They also agreed to pay restitution, and they paid restitution within a year. Some would say they should have paid more restitution, but that's a different question. Okay, if you're saying that the issue is money, then say it's about money.
Yeah,
these people don't make it an issue of money.
No, the question is, was there a conspiracy? Did Israel attack specifically a United States asset on purpose in order to drag it into war? The point is, first of all, there's no need at this point to drag anyone into anything. And whenever the United States intervened in any of the conflicts up till then, and in fact, since then too, the United States is always the one pushing the brakes on things, especially on Israel doing stuff. So the last thing Israel would want, especially the stuff that was going on, and there's a very good book about the 6-Day War, and it's actually not about the 6-Day War, but there's a book called The Accidental Empire, and just the beginning of it is about the 6-Day War. And when you read the dynamics of what's going on within Israel in the war during that time, the last thing those people wanted was the United States to intervene in an actual military sense, because they had to make ground.
Yeah.
But never mind, that's a different story. I think. Yeah. Sorry.
Yeah. Chef, based on what you read, why do you think the attack happened? This is the thing that's kind of puzzling. If there was a big U.S. flag on the ship, why would the Israelis attack?
Why would they attack it? Now there's a lot of different strands to the theories. Some of them do make a little bit of sense. There is a theory that Israel had warned the U.S. not to bring any ships into their into the vicinity of their waters. It wasn't in Israeli waters, but it was it was pretty close to the coast of Egypt, and the Americans the Americans ignored it, and therefore there is a theory that the Air Force and Navy in Israel decided to make an example of it in order to say, well, we warned you and you didn't listen. Another theory, which is not plausible, is that they were trying to now remember, on the 8th, a lot of the Israeli forces were moving across Israel back towards the northern border with Syria in order to take the Golan Heights. The theory is that they were trying to cover up the Golan invasion, but the fact is that Israel had already informed the Americans, and I think they even released to the press a couple announcements that they were going to transfer the focus to the Golan to the northern front. So,
but that's dumb. That's dumb anyway. I mean, what does a ship in the Mediterranean have to do with
the theory is because a lot of the people who are USS Liberty boosters, that's what I would call them, they actually deny that it was a spy ship. The serious people who are into this topic all acknowledge it was a spy ship. It's been acknowledged as a spy ship. There were several other ones of the same class that one of them was captured in North Korea a year later, the Pueblo, which some people blame on Israel by saying, well, because they got away with attacking the Liberty, the North Koreans thought that they could get away with the Pueblo, and they did. But this was a surveillance ship. It had now what they had was this equipment that they could. It was UHF radio detection equipment. So if they had line of sight with whatever action was going on, so they could see into what was happening in El Arish, they could listen to any communications over there. So the logic was that perhaps the Israelis didn't know the full surveillance capabilities of the ship. So if they were to, straddle the coast and go along the Israeli coast up towards the north, and or even listen to along the coast where the highways where troops were being transferred northward, they could possibly pick up on Israeli radio communications about troop movements. So, and then there's an even more weird theory that they were afraid that the Liberty would be able to detect communications about a massacre of Egyptian POWs, which there's never been any evidence that showed it. I don't think the Egyptian government ever claimed that their soldiers were butchered in a massacre. So a lot of
there was some cases where POWs were just shot to death because the Israelis didn't know what to do with them. But this came out only years later. It came out many years later, and this is when this story I think came out. This is when the Liberty boosters adopted that into the narrative, because the story about the POWs being shot, this came out like. When the archives opened, I think it was 25 years later or something like that.
In Israel, it's usually 30, but it might have been open. Yeah. Well, it's an interesting case. When I listened to it first, when I was in the army, we were still in Lebanon, and anyone who remembers that time, anyone who knows anything about ongoing combat, the amount of times that you shoot at the wrong people, whether they're your own or civilians or whatever, it happens all the fucking time. The fog of war is indeed quite thick. You don't know if someone says, "Listen, this ship is a hostile. Go after it. Go get it." If it has a flag, it doesn't have a flag, you don't give a fuck. Like, do you know what flag it is? Is there? Maybe today they have positive electronic markers, and you can say for sure, by this e-signature, this is the ship that it says it is. But even that, not really. So. A flag alone doesn't mean anything, and by the time.
So let me bring up something that.
In the 6 days.
Yeah. Yeah, you can go ahead, Zara, if you want.
No, I'm just saying. In the 6 days war, a lot of Israelis were killed by friendly fire. And at the same time, in Vietnam, a lot of Americans were killed by friendly fire. Israelis killed themselves in the 6 days war. There were a lot of cases, and as for that, the Liberty, the reason why the whole thing happened is there was apparently a couple of explosions in El Arish, which they thought was being bombed from the sea. Apparently,
I remember
went off.
From what I remember, again, this was now ages ago when I still actually operated Johnnyversity on a regular basis. From what I remember, the ship was flagged as an enemy, as a hostile ship. The Air Force was scrambled, and they just started shooting. Now, first of all, when
and then the Navy attacked it.
Again, once anything is flagged as an enemy, you shoot at it and you take it down. It doesn't matter what marking it has on it. It might as well have had an Israeli flag. Most probable wouldn't have mattered. Wouldn't have mattered anyway.
So there's the issue that many people like they can't explain is if they attacked the ship and they wanted to cover something up, why didn't they sink it entirely? Why did they let it survive and limp back to Malta? And nobody can really explain that. And even
I think
some
they
of them,
tried.
Jim Ennis, who, the Israelis?
No, I think they tried to sink
Well,
it.
at a certain point, they called off their attack. At a certain point, the Israeli Navy started to offer aid to the ship. Now, it might have come later. Some say it came because the Americans became aware because the Liberty was able to communicate with one of the other Sixth Fleet ship vessels, and by then the Israelis were like, "Oh shit, we can't just keep doing this. Now we have to pretend to offer aid." But whatever the case, they didn't sink the ship entirely. But so a lot of the debate is over the timeline. A lot of it is the timeline of William McGonigal, the captain of the ship, contradicts the timeline of many of the survivors. That's an understandable conflict. I think that a lot of people, there's allegations that he was passed out for part of it because he lost blood. So I don't know if we can find an objective account of what happened on the Liberty, whether it's from William McGonigal, who's now dead. He died in, I think, the 2000s, or any of his crew members. And a lot of his crew members who are giving testimony, they were below decks, like I said. They couldn't see what was happening outside, so they heard it from other people that were above decks, that they were on the deck or whatever. I wasn't in the Navy, so forgive me if I'm getting... people are going to fact check me. Oh, you said starboard when it was really port. But look, the fact is that there were a lot of people who have accounts of what happened that weren't able to see what was happening because they were wounded, because they were on duty in the engine room. Those aren't good vantage points for what happened. There are photographs that indicate what happened, but they don't document the number of strafing runs by the Air Force. But if you're looking at my screen right now, I think you guys can still see it.
Yeah.
This is something, AJ Crystal brought this up, and I was a little stunned because the USS Stark was attacked in 1987 in international waters by a Dassault plane, Dassault, whatever you call it, and they were hit by two Exocet missiles, which were, if you don't know, Exocets are I think they're air-to-sea missiles that produced here by the United States. But the difference is that it wasn't Israel that fired the missiles, it was the Iraqi Air Force in 1987. And if you go onto Amazon, I want you guys at home, those of you that are watching, to do a search on Amazon and look for books on the USS Stark attack. And tell me how many you find and compare that to how many are written about the Liberty.
Yeah. So
this is something that I never heard about this attack. And it killed actually more sailors than the Liberty attack. First of all, because the weaponry was more modern. But nobody who is part of this community of people is calling for justice against Iraq, obviously, because since then there's been 2 wars against Iraq. There have been, we've occupied Iraq. So there's no call for justice against the perpetrators of the USS Stark attack the way that there has been about the USS Liberty. And that's demonstrated by the lack of real information about the Stark out there on the internet. So yeah, I would say that, granted all the blame that Israel is rightly receiving over the USS Liberty attack, at a certain point you have to realize that restitution was paid, responsibility was taken. A lot of the people who were involved are now dead. A lot of the people who survived the attack, unfortunately, they're never going to get back. They had life-ruining injuries, or they lost friends. Possibly, they suffered from PTSD. Obviously, that's what we call it now. Back in Vietnam, it wasn't called PTSD, or I think after Vietnam, they called it PTSD. So this happened during the war. We can never resolve things that have already happened completely. But you can't continue to use the USS Liberty as some sort of fulcrum in order to move U.S. foreign policy with regard to the Middle East. It just isn't as relevant as it was back in 1967.